So our program at the moment works. It doesn't produce a great deal. That's because we didn't really sent in an empty list and just the item Frank. So it's always going to print out Frank. But what we have done is worked out that if the list was empty, we're going to append Frank to the list. If it isn't empty, we're going to run through the list, finding two things: the current position, starting off at 0 and then going up to 1, then to 2, then 3, then 4, until we find the position. So in other words, we've found it. It's between, on this one, between 1 and 2. So we found it at 2. We need to insert it at that point. Now we have a little bit of a problem here. Again, it comes to this one. Do we append or do we insert? Now, if we've reached the end of the list, we have to append, because if we didn't, we would get a crash because there's no position beyond the end of the list. So in this scenario, we would have to append. If, however, we were trying to, if we'd found it at Eric, we'd need to use the insert method. So I've got to check for that now. So once I've been through this block, I've come out with either I found a position, in other words it's in between two pieces of data, or I've run out and I've run out of list basically. I haven't found it at all. So I need to handle that situation. And I am now out of the loop, so I need to come back as far as the while and check. What I'm checking for is if I found the position that it needs to be inserted at. So if found, now I could do if found is equal to true. That would be okay in Python. However, being a programmer, I always like shortcuts. And I don't really need to test if something is true using the double equal sign and the word. I can just put if found. So it's either going to be true or it's going to be false. That's good enough. So if found. So what do I need to do if I found where it goes? I need to look at this instruction. Okay, so I found a position. I need to insert it into the list. So that's all I need. So I can now put data dot insert and insert it at the current position. And if you don't understand or know that, if you go back to your list manipulation here, insert, we've got a number and an item. So the number comes first, which is current position, and the item is Frank or David or whatever we're trying to put in. Current position and then the item. Now I've got to handle the position whereby, well, I haven't found it. I ran through the entire list. Okay, I've got to the end of the list. I haven't found it. And in that case, if I try to insert, it would crash. So I need to do the same that I did up here. I've got to append my item to the list. And in fact, it's exactly the same line of code. So I could just copy it and paste it. There you go. Just the same as if I'd got an empty list. I'm trying to add something onto the end, so I'm just appending it. And that is it. That is the routine written. So what we need to do is test it to make sure it's doing what it's supposed to do. So I'm going to run it first, just to make sure there's no syntax errors and crashes. There we go. Still got my Frank coming out. Now I'm going to start changing things. So if I had a list with Anne to begin with, now we have to be careful here because we're using capitals. It might be best if you just used all lowercase. So I've got a list with Anne, so I'm expecting Frank to be the last item. I expect to see Anne followed by Frank when I run through my list. So if I run this one again, there you go, I've got Anne and Frank. Now let's put sort of Eric in. Eric should be between Anne and Frank. So if I now have Frank in my list and I try to put Eric in, not Ferric, Eric, that will do. Eric should appear between Anne and Frank. So run my program again. There we go, and Eric, Frank. And now if I have another name like Zach, Zach should be at the end of the list. So if I try to insert Zach, he should be at the end of the list. Perfect. Now my only problem is, what happens if I've got something before Anne? Trying to think of a name that appears before Anne. Aisling. There we go. AI comes before AN. So Aisling should be inserted before Anne. So if I run my module again, there we go. Aisling, Anne and Frank. So it works. It inserts at the start, it inserts at the end, it inserts in the middle, and it inserts into an empty list. And again, as I said, be careful with that there, because we're looking for the order. So it should be greater. We should start at A's and work our way up. If we did it the other way round, then we would have a list which was going in the opposite direction, Z to A. So if I again start with an empty list, so I've changed the order, so now we should be ordering from Z to A. If I run that, there we go, that's an empty list, it's just put the 1 in. Now if I put Aisling in there, and if I try to insert Zach, so instead of Zach being at the end of the list, Zach should be the first item in the list. Run that one again. And there we go, it's working as expected. Now, this line here is the important line. If you remember going back to the scores when we were looking at this list here, where we're dealing with scores, we weren't really bothered with the name. As you can see, the names are not ordered in any way. C comes after J and E comes after J, and after C, it's all mixed up order. However, the numbers are in order. If we wanted to write a program that handled numbers and not the name, so we've got a true high score list, not based on names, then the only line we need to change is this line, is exactly what we're looking at. I'm going to change that back to greater than. So it's the bigger numbers go to the bottom. This is the only line that we need to change. It doesn't really take too much in the way of thinking to actually understand what we've got to do. A little bit of testing in the shell will help us do that work, and we'll look at that later, not now. But nothing else in our sort routine needs changing. And in fact, we can just take that out, and now we've got a routine that we can use. The only thing we need to do is change that depending on the type of data that we're playing around with. So that will work nicely. That's your insertion sort working.